Russia has just launched a major new offensive in the Donbas, deploying armored columns again, increasing attacks across the entire front line, and yet despite all of this, the outcome already looks painfully familiar. Because instead of breakthroughs, we are once again seeing something very different: minimal territorial gains and a dramatic surge in Russian losses. So what exactly is different about this spring offensive, and why has Russia shifted its tactics again? And perhaps most importantly, is this offensive already doomed to fail? So that's exactly what we are going to break down today. Hi, my name is Alexander Korton. I'm a strategic analyst and media manager from Austria, and I'm also the founder of the German YouTube channel Geopol, and today we want to take a closer look about the Russian spring offensive. But first, if you've been following the coverage of the war in Ukraine over the past few months, you may have noticed something subtle but very important, because the tone in the media has changed. Because for a long time, many reports described a constant Russian advance, and some analysts even portrayed the Russian army as an unstoppable force, slowly grinding forward no matter the cost. But recently that narrative has gone quiet, and there are two simple but important reasons for that. First, Russian progress has slowed dramatically, and in many cases the only way Russia managed to capture territory was by sacrificing thousands of infantrymen over months just to take a single village, or at best a small town like Chuliopole. And even places that were described as major turning points failed to change the bigger picture. The best example for this is the capture of the city Pokrovsk, because instead of enabling rapid advances, they simply shifted the battlefield a few kilometers further, continuing the same and slow attritional war now in Kherson. But at the same time, Ukraine has just not held the line, and in some areas Kiev was able to push back as well. Because according to the Ukrainian military leadership and Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky, Ukraine has managed to liberate over 400 square kilometers in the past few months. So we see Ukraine is now able to launch offensives on its own. And for the first time since the summer of 2024, Ukraine regained more ground than Russia captured during the same time frame of 1 month. So the past months has not exactly been successful for the Russian Federation, but in the Kremlin there is still the belief that one decisive push could break the deadlock. And that's where this new spring offensive comes in. But the problem for Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, it already shows signs of turning into a familiar disaster like the last few offensives. Because over the past days, Russian activity along the front has increased significantly. The number of daily attacks was surged to well over 200 engagements per day, far higher than in previous months. And the fighting has intensified across multiple sectors, but one area stands out in particular: the region around the sector Liman. Because here Russian forces are attacking from multiple directions, attempting to force rapid collapse of the Ukrainian defense. And the strategy behind the assaults on Liman is quite simple, because if Russia could capture Liman, it could open a path towards Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, the key fortress line for Ukraine's defense in Donbas. And with the capture of Liman, Russian forces could attack Slovyansk and Kramatorsk from the north and would not be relying on a direct assault from the east, which would be way harder. But what makes the offensive at Liman especially interesting is not just where Russia is attacking, it's how. Because in recent months, Russian forces relied heavily on small infantry groups. These units tried to infiltrate Ukrainian positions quietly, avoiding detection by drones and gradually gaining ground. And this approach, of course, reduced losses of expensive equipments like tanks and armored vehicles, but it came at a massive human cost, and more importantly, it made fast breakthroughs almost impossible. But for now, Russia appears to be shifting its tactics again. Because what we are seeing is a return to something we've witnessed before in 2023 and 2024, a use of large-scale mechanized assaults. Because armored columns supported by infantry and a wide range of vehicles are once again being deployed in an attempt to overwhelm Ukrainian position. And the recent attack near Liman illustrates this shift perfectly, because Russian forces reportedly launched a battalion-sized assault involving hundreds of troops, dozens of armored vehicles and even larger numbers of light transport vehicles, just like ATVs and motorcycles. And at first glance and on paper, this sounds like a formidable force, but in reality it achieved almost nothing. Because Ukrainian reconnaissance drones detected the assault early, allowing defenders to respond before Russian units could even reach their objectives, and the result for Russia was devastating. Because within a short time, multiple tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed, along with dozens of lighter vehicles, and the assault stalled and the attackers suffered heavy casualties without even reaching the Ukrainian positions. And the horrific losses in Liman were not an isolated incident. Because just days earlier, Russian forces attempted to use poor weather conditions to their advantage. And under the cover of fog and rain, they launched another wave of attacks in the southern Donbas around Chulyapole, Dobropilya and Kryshine. The idea behind was simple: reduced visibility would limit drone effectiveness and allow Russian troops to advance undetected. But the reality again turned out very differently, because Ukrainian drone units were still able to identify and engage the attackers, inflicting heavy losses even before the main assault began. And as the attacks continued into the following day, the casualties mounted rapidly. And according to the Ukrainian drone commander Robert Madyabrovty, Ukrainian drone forces eliminated over 900 Russian soldiers in 1.5 days. And taking all of this together now, these engagements paint a very clear picture of the Russian spring offensive. Because despite increased intensity, the offensive has so far failed to produce significant territorial gains, and at the same time Russian losses have surged dramatically. And estimates from the Ukrainian side suggest that the Russian army lost over 10,000 soldiers between 1 week. And 2 days especially reached new record numbers, because Russia lost in 2 days well over 1,700 soldiers. But all of this raises an important question. Why are the losses so high? And part of the answer is very simple. More attacks mean more exposure and therefore more casualties for the Russian Federation. But there is also a second and deeper reason. Because Ukraine's defensive system has become far more efficient. And what we saw for a long time was that many analysts focused on Ukraine's manpower shortages, and there were repeated calls, especially from Western allies, just like the United States of America, for Kiev to mobilize more soldiers and expand its army because of infantry shortages. And yes, Ukraine has faced real challenges in recruitment, that's for sure. But at the same time, there has always been another perspective inside Ukraine itself. Because some people argued that simply sending more troops to the front would not solve the problem, it would only increase the losses of Ukraine. Because more infantrymen on the front line mean more targets for the Russian Federation, and Russian gliding bombs could neutralize more Ukrainians with one hit. So instead, the focus inside of Ukraine shifted toward maximizing effectiveness per soldier and not increasing the poor number of soldiers. And exactly this is where the nature of modern warfare becomes crucial, because today's battlefield is defined by technology, drones, electronic warfare, real-time surveillance and precision strikes. And in this environment, the key question is no longer who has more soldiers, but who can generate more combat power with fewer risks for their own army. And we can now say the Ukrainian strategy increasingly reflects this reality. Because drone units now play a central role, accounting for a significant share of Russian losses, and these systems allow Ukraine to detect, track and destroy targets long before they ever reach the front line. And this creates what some analysts describe as the expanded kill zone, because Russian forces are being engaged kilometers before they can ever encounter Ukrainian infantry, and in many cases Ukrainian soldiers don't need to directly confront the enemy at all. Instead, the defender relies on a layered system of drones, artillery and coordinated strikes to disrupt and destroy advancing Russian units. And we've already seen this approach succeed before, for example in operations around Kupiansk, where Russian offensives were halted and even reversed through coordinated long-range firepower and the implementation of a long-range kill zone. And we are now seeing similar patterns again in southern Ukraine in the Oblast Dnipropetrovsk. And all this is very important for the Ukrainian defense lines and shows that Vladimir Putin's plan of battle won't succeed. Because one of Russia's core assumptions has been that it can outlast Ukraine in a war of attrition, that continuous pressure will eventually exhaust the Ukrainian forces. But that logic only works if Ukraine suffers comparable losses when Russia is attacking. And increasingly that is just not the case. Because if Ukrainian forces can inflict heavy losses while minimizing their own exposure, the entire equation changes. But what does this mean for the current spring offensive for the Russian Federation? So at this stage, two conclusions stand out for me. First, the offensive is unlikely to achieve decisive results. It may produce some small territorial gains here and there, but not at the scale that could force Ukraine into collapse or fundamentally change the course of the war. But at the same time, the offensive is already generating extremely high costs for Russia in both manpower and equipment. And that combination is difficult to sustain, and at the same time we see that Ukraine's approach suggests something equally important. Because the earlier manpower challenges inside Ukraine are no longer be seen as decisive, and by adapting to the realities of modern warfare, Ukraine has found ways to offset numerical disadvantages and maintain effective defenses. And in fact, the relative silence in recent Western discussions about Ukrainian manpower shortages may reflect a deeper shift. Because one, the assumption that Ukraine's army will break down with its manpower shortage is now quietly reconsidered. So for me the question now is not just whether the Russian offensive will fail, but whether it reveals something bigger about the future of this war. Because Russia is repeating the same costly patterns here once again and is not able to sustain the pressure on Ukrainian front lines for so long that the Ukrainian army could collapse, because Ukraine just don't suffer enough casualties for that, while at the same time the Russian casualties increased and increased. So we can say the Russian spring offensive is already doomed to fail, and the only thing that it will achieve is increasing Russian losses. But how do you assess the current situation at the front line and the beginning of this new Russian offensive? Could it still pose a serious threat to the Ukrainian defense forces, or will it fade like so many previous attacks from Vladimir Putin? I'm of course looking forward to read your thoughts, and I will enjoy reading the comments. Otherwise, if you found this video helpful and informative, please do make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel Geopol Global. And otherwise, I will end the video here. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one.